When I was 12 years old, I got an unusual opportunity where I was able to be involved in a study abroad program, and I would live in England for several months. I'm from a very small town in the US originally, and the program was run through my middle school, so I went overseas with a group of around 15 other 12-year-olds. Before we went to the homes we would be living in for the next few months, we ended up staying in London for about a week to do some sightseeing. When we got there, we were staying in a small hostel downtown, and my school had essentially rented out the entire hostel for the kids and for the adults that were chaperoning us, and if I remember correctly, there were 2 adults with us. Every day we would have a scheduled activity, and then we would have a significant amount of free time where we were allowed to explore the city as a group, with just the kids and no adults. The second day we were there, my friends and I were out together, and we ended up stopping to look at some kiosks that were about a block from our hostel, to look at some souvenirs. I was around the back side of the kiosk, looking like I was alone, when I suddenly felt someone grab my arm. I turned to see a middle-aged man, most likely homeless, looking at me as he says, "Hello there, pretty little girl," in the creepiest voice I have ever heard. I immediately darted around the other side of the kiosk and back to my friends, before I could even tell them what had happened, and he followed me around and got super close to me and said, "You can run, you can hide, but I will find you." Then he walked away. I immediately grabbed my friend and started pulling her back towards the direction of our hostel. I was crying when we got back there and told our chaperones what had just happened. They essentially brushed it off and didn't do anything. But every day we were in London from then on, I would see him 1 to 3 times a day when we were out. He would never get too close and never say anything, but he would always be smiling whilst watching me. And every time I would see him, I would point him out to either one of the chaperones or another kid in our group. On the last day we were there, we were getting ready to leave, and we were catching a train from London to Leeds. While we were waiting at the train platform, I suddenly heard, "Bye, little girl. I will see you soon." I turned around and sure enough he was there. He then quickly left, and again no one in my group really did anything, except for the other kids, as they were all completely freaked out. I never saw him again after that, but I still remember his voice, and every time I think of it I get a shiver down my spine and think about how close to danger I was. This happened to me in the summer of 2015. For context, I am a female and at the time was in my early 20s and was attending university. My house contract had ended and in essence I was homeless, but determined to make it all work. I lived in a friend's flat and slept on their sofa. I was working all kinds of jobs, basically anything that was short-term and could give me some cash so I could buy food and save some money. I was young and didn't have any prior work experience, so I couldn't really pick what jobs I would be applying for. I would write endless applications and hope that I even just got a call for an interview. I applied for a waiting staff job in a tea house by the sea, where I assumed either posh local people or tourists would go, so it sounded perfect. The job was quite far from where I was staying, but I couldn't really be picky. When I got there, which is somewhere I'd never been before, it was absolutely empty. It looked like it had been recently renovated, and in a way not even fully finished. There were no customers, no staff, no one, just me and a man who was the owner. I didn't think much of it as I usually get paranoid over nothing. It was quite a small place and it looked expensive. We sat in one of the rooms for the interview. The owner was a young man, probably in his 30s, and he started by asking me about my experience and what I was studying at university. We ended up chatting about photography, as this was what I'd studied, and it had nothing to do with hospitality. However, he moved on to asking me what was my favourite food and drink. I didn't find this weird, as it was a job in a place which served food and drinks, but as I was about to leave, he asked how I was getting home and offered to give me a ride back. I declined his offer, but not very easily, and began walking back home. As a young female without much experience, at first I naively thought that maybe he was just a nice guy, that the interview probably went well, and I had successfully secured myself some future income. That afternoon I received a text from this person, who'd interviewed me only a few hours earlier. He was asking me to meet him so he could tell me the results of the interview. I didn't respond as it was after 5 to 6 p.m, and I wondered why he would message after working hours. He then texted me again, confirming that he knew my address and read it to me. Of course my address and phone number are on my CV, and he was coming to pick me up in half an hour to have dinner with me. I was crapping myself, and I remember hanging on the balcony sporadically just to see if he had stalked me to my then temporary home. I was so glad to have friends there with me. I don't know if the guy came in the end, and I blocked his number and never replied to him. I was also staying in a block of flats, so thankfully he wasn't able to know exactly where I was. I feel a bit upset that I could be so naive, and that there was a vulnerability for me to be abused or to get a job by having dinner with the owner. This makes me sick, just thinking about it, and how normalized it can be. This happened a while ago, so some details such as my age and what I was doing exactly might be a little fuzzy. I'm a pretty short white Asian female. I was around 4 or 6 years old at the time, and my family, mum, dad and my younger sister who was 2, were at a very popular water park in my country. I knew it was very popular due to the size of it, and I still go there from time to time with them. I was young and very independent, and I wandered off to go try some slides and just explore the park, since I'd only been there a few times before and wanted to find more secret paths. I'll get to that later. I was in the main playground area, where most of the kids were, when I saw a duck mascot. Big deal. It was just taking pictures with other children and just doing what it usually does. Until I turned and it was staring at me. I was this small child, no parent or guardian figure in sight, wandering around the darker area near the deck chairs. By the time I noticed it, it was almost done taking pictures and was waving to another family when it looked back at me. At this point I was a little shaken and began toddling off to another slide. Now this water park is big. According to its website, it's around 3.8 hectares and had a lot of back routes to slides, staff areas and restaurants. Remember how I said I was finding secret paths? Well, there was this one that led from the playground to a slide called the Boomerang. It was completely deserted, under the shade of large palm trees and a nice pretty green. I was at the beginning of it when I noticed it. The mascot was behind me, just standing there, arms at its side. I tried to dismiss it as it's probably just taking a rest. Young me knew that they were people in suits, so it must be a pretty tiring job taking pictures all day in the hot sun. So I continued walking down. That's when it started following me. I remember the fear slowly rising in me as I noticed it. This duck mascot with its smiling face, dreadlocks and forward-facing eyes, slowly walking as it looked down at me, a child half its height. It walked with its arms still at its sides, shuffling each foot forwards on the concrete ground. I quickened my pace down the path. I remembered wanting to cry out my parents' name, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe it was the feeling that the duck would grab me and feed on my fear like some type of dementor once I screamed out. Soon I saw the end of the tunnel, after what felt like ages of walking, but was just really 3 minutes, and I ran out to the crowded tables of people laughing and eating. I turned the corner to enter the Boomerang slide and ran up the stairs to the top. It was when I was at the end of the queue halfway up the stairs that I noticed the duck mascot at the bottom. It was taking pictures, but then when it wasn't, it stared up at me. I was horrified. I pushed myself to the man in front of me, trying to find some sort of comfort. I just waited in that queue. Now if this was any other day, I would have ridden the boomerang again and again. It was a great slide, especially at this particular water park. I didn't want to ride down on a tube just to fall into the hands of this mascot waiting at the bottom. I was shivering when I got to the top and grabbed a tube. The duck was out of view at this point, so I just hoped with all my heart that it was still taking pictures and that I could bolt behind it and run back to my parents. The ride was okay. Since I was small, I didn't go that far up. I closed my eyes as it went down, dreading the grabbing sensation that would meet me at the bottom. And by the miracles of the water park, I wasn't met with one. I opened my eyes and the mascot was nowhere to be seen. I got off the tube quickly and ran to where I last saw my parents, holding back the tears. By the time I found them, they were packing up and my younger sister was eating an ice cream. I left that water park with a popsicle of my own and was terrified to return. Now, I don't know if that dude in the suit was just doing his job and just happened to take that route to the other slide, but that had a lasting effect on me, to the point where I have trouble with a few friends of mine who make fursuits. Now, I admire the craft, but I just keep having that heart-sinking feeling that the suit's just going to come alive and suffocate me, or them. I haven't gone to a theme park in years, and when I have, I avoided any mascots that I saw. I almost threw my friend in front of me when one approached. I still even go to that water park, as I said, as it's an awesome park. But I've seen that duck mascot a few other times when I've been there, and I'm pretty certain that that one person under the mask isn't the same one who followed me. Most of them took zero notice of me, but that might be because I'm older now and don't look as inviting as I did when I was a kid. I can't remember the exact date, but it must have been in summer because the afternoon was unbearably hot. I don't like walking my dogs at that time because I can't and will never live knowing that they are burning their paws on the ground. Thus I decided to go right before sunset. Everything had cooled down by then, plus I would get to see the beautiful paintbrush marks in the sky. For me it was a win-win. It was my usual route, and there were tons of dog walkers during this time. But this time instead it was eerily quiet. You could drop a pin and it would sound like an explosion. That quiet. I'm a girl and my number one rule is to never have both earphones in. I watch too many true crime YouTube videos, and I'm a very cynical person, so I tend to be cautious, almost anxiety-driven. So halfway through my walk I heard a truck. Its tires crunching against the dirt and slowing its pace. I turned around. I was in front of a driveway, so I quickly sped so as to not be in front of it. But instead of turning into the driveway, it kept going and stopped again. My heart started racing, pounding like the rhythm of a drum. It got even faster when I noticed the guy in the car roll down his window. "Cute dogs you got there," he said. I sighed a breath of relief. My dogs are cute, solid 10 out of 10s, and it wasn't unusual for people to compliment them. I said thank you and continued walking. I almost laughed as I felt so dumb in that moment. That is until I heard the screeching of the tires. It sounded like they'd gone 15 to 100 in 3 seconds flat. I was so startled I flinched and whipped my head back to see that he had parked right behind me. Then I heard the very familiar click of a car door unlocking. I immediately tried to start booking it to my house, keyword being tried. One of my dogs doesn't like running, so she stopped and fought against me. She was tugging against me so hard that her collar slowly started to slip off. I picked her up, and just as I did, I saw both his feet touch the ground. I ran. When he saw me running, he immediately got back into the truck and started it up again. I couldn't tell if he was following me, but I wasn't going to stop to find out. I have never run that fast in my life, as I have horrible stamina, so I can't run for more than 2 minutes before my body starts giving up. I ran so hard until I got home that my whole body was aching. I ran into the house almost crying. A few family members were there, so I took my mum aside and told her about it. When we came back out, I looked outside and saw his truck going up and down the neighborhood. I didn't walk the dogs for about a month after that, and I just hoped that he wasn't successful in kidnapping some other person that day. This happened to me around 3 years ago, when I was 19 at the time, living in a different country to where I'm from, and it was 2 a.m, and I was coming back to my house after visiting a friend. Now, to get to my house, I had to go through a park, which is barely illuminated, and it runs alongside a river. As I was walking by, I started to hear the steps of 2 people directly behind me. As I noticed the shadows on the ground, I started going a bit faster. At the end of the park, it was even darker, so I wanted to pass it as soon as possible and get to the big avenue, though thinking I was being a bit paranoid. Then I started to hear the steps getting closer and closer. One of the guys who was following me passed me by, and once he turned around, looked at me, and made a hand gesture, like he was trying to say something, maybe to me, or maybe to the other guy who was still behind me. By this time, I started to think that I wasn't being paranoid at all, so I pulled my phone out and called the friend who I had just left. But my phone only had 3% battery left, and I was starting to panic. I didn't want to call the police as they would hear me doing it, so I asked my friend to do it instead, as I'm not a native, and I couldn't speak the language fluently, so they wouldn't understand what I was saying. There was one of them walking in front of me and the other behind me. My phone had died at this point, and I was getting more and more nervous as I was making my way finally to the avenue. Still, nobody was in the street, just a few crackers, but I felt safer in the light. The person that was in front of me started to get into every single street at our right, wait for me. He would wait for me to pass by, then come from behind to pass me by again. This continued on, with me being followed and being locked between these 2 men. I was now about 2 minutes away from my house, and I didn't know if I wanted them to know where I lived. But once I got to my street, I just started running as fast as I could. I got in the house, ran to my bedroom, and looked out of my window to see them talking and walking back to the park. I then called the police and gave them a description of these 2 men. It was terrifying, as I don't know what they wanted from me. Were they just trying to scare me for fun? I don't know. So this story is from when I was younger. I grew up in a military family. My dad retired when I was around 4 or 5 years old, but after spending the better half of his life in the military, he still felt restless staying in the same place longer than a few years. And because of that, we moved around a lot. Usually we'd only spend a handful of years in one place before he started looking for jobs elsewhere, and we'd begin to pack it all up. Moving so often meant that I never really got to settle anywhere. I never really had a consistent group of friends, so my siblings and I learned to get along fast. We became our own friend group and learned how to have fun and entertain ourselves without others. Because of the nature of my dad's civilian job, we were permitted to move to a military base in New England. I always felt off there. It felt dark and sad all the time. My family and I often heard footsteps stomping around the second floor of our housing unit in the middle of the night when everyone claimed to be in bed. I had reoccurring nightmares that a man was staring at me through my bedroom window, even though my bedroom was on the second floor. Our dog would stare down the door to the hallway closet and refuse to walk near it. But eventually we just got used to the weird and tuned it out. And by the time this story takes place, I was 9 and my brother was 13. Our other siblings were already adults and had moved out, so it was just me and him. This happened sometime in the spring. My family decided to go for a walk around, and after about 30 minutes, my parents decided to turn back and go home, but my brother and I wanted to stay out a bit longer. Our parents let us go around and told us to be back before taps. Taps is usually played on military bases at night, sort of to say, okay, it's bedtime now, go to sleep. The base we lived on played taps at 9 p.m, which signalled curfew for all miners on the base. If the MPs caught you out after taps played, they were allowed to escort you home or stay with you while you call your parents to come get you. So my brother and I were so excited to go exploring that we took off running. My brother and I have always been into creepy things. Our oldest brother was a bit of a punk rocker in his youth, along with our sister, so we learned our love for creepy and off-putting things from them. We'd often watch horror movies and tell scary stories when they babysat us. My brother and I walked around for a while before he told me about an area behind the public pool that we could go explore. It was a long access road that trailed up the hill and into the trees, so of course my brother and I just had to go check it out. We stayed hidden in the trees, as it was fairly easy to follow the road, and we were less likely to be caught if concealed. Eventually we got to the end, and it was a large clearing with buildings in it. My brother and I supposed it was the enlisted barracks and continued to explore. We wanted to cross through the clearing and around these buildings to get to the other side. We made our game plan and started to go through. About halfway between two of the buildings, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming down the sidewalk. My brother and I quickly hid behind some bushes. It was dark enough that we shouldn't have been seen, and we watched through a gap in the leaves, waiting for the footsteps to pass. It sounded like the footsteps got about to the bushes where we were hiding, but paused before the person was in view. Suddenly the footsteps hightailed it in the opposite direction. It wasn't in a way that signalled the person was going for a jog or run before bed. It sounded desperate, like they saw something and had to beat feet to get away. My brother and I looked around and saw nothing, but we did see the person running away. They were wearing what looked like a utility uniform, just without the blouse. But my brother and I both got chills and felt like we were in danger. There was nothing really wrong, so to say, but seeing that person just made us feel weird. I turned to say something to him, but I couldn't speak. He looked concerned. For the first time in my life, I saw my brother afraid. His eyes were stuck on the person. Then, they were just standing in the parking lot. The person turned back around and stared directly at the bush we were behind. It was like they knew we were there and were daring us to come out. When the person started coming at the bush again, my brother grabbed my arm and rushed me back into the woods. He told me to move as fast as I could and to stay quiet. We clambered out of the woods and were back by the public pool when he told me we had to get home. We both ran across the street and turned to look back at the access road as we walked away. Part of me was searching for a sign, maybe one that said restricted access or no trespassing, so I could justify why this person was behaving strangely. I knew my brother was waiting for that person to come out after us, but they never did. We got back across the base to where the housing was. We made our way up the road in complete silence. Both of us were still scared. I didn't know what I was supposed to say. Should we tell our parents about it? Do we keep it a secret? Who was that person? My brother and I had lightened up the closer we got to our house. We were about 3 streets away from our house before we heard those footsteps again. And we heard taps begin to sound off the speakers and picked up our pace. Once taps finished, my brother turned to look at the source of the footsteps. "Hey boys," the person called out to us. I turned to look and saw that it was the same person we saw by the barracks building. My brother put his hand on my shoulder and guided me to be walking in front of him. He told me not to turn around again and to just keep walking. "Hey," the person called out again. "I'm worried about you two. Are you both all right?" "Our parents called and are waiting for us. We're just going home, sir," my brother called out. "I'm worried you boys will catch a cold. Come here a minute," they called again. It wasn't very cold out. Even then, my brother and I had sweaters and long jeans on. "We're all right. We live just around the corner." My brother lied, trying to make it seem like we were almost home and didn't need an escort. "I need to make sure you two are okay. Come here," the person said again. Really, it's okay, we're almost home. Come here, James, the person demanded. My brother and I froze. How did that person know my brother's name? Are you an MP? My brother asked. The footsteps behind us stopped and we both looked at the person following us. They were probably 30 feet away, just standing there under the street lamp with a big smile on their face. But their eyes were so cold, I still feel sick thinking about it to this day. With a deep sigh, the person called out to us, "How smart. Smart boys. Very smart, good boys." They started walking towards us at fast pace. My brother and I figured what they were planning on doing, but we didn't stay long enough to find out. We ran off into a backyard and zigzagged through houses and yards until we got to our street. We sprinted up our driveway and into our house, shutting and locking the door behind us. Our parents were waiting at the dinner table to chew us out for coming home late, but my brother and I were too scared to tell them what had happened, so we didn't. My brother and I never went to the public pool anymore, and we stopped going for walks without our parents. As for the person, I would often see people who looked similar to them around base. I never knew for sure, but I'm almost certain I've seen them standing across the street when I got out of school, more than once. So this was early morning on July 5th, 2019, in Daly City, California. It was 3:30 a.m. and I was walking a mere 2.5 blocks to my car for work. Now the city never sleeps, as cities do, and there were always people out and about at all time of the morning. I usually walk to the opposite side of the street to avoid whoever is coming down in the early mornings and late nights, just as a safety precaution, as I'm generally a hyper-aware person, due to prior life experiences. Now, I didn't live in the best area of town, and whenever people asked where I lived, they would say things along the lines of, "Damn, that's not a good area." But I was single and making it on my own however I could, so I couldn't be picky about where I was able to live. At the time, I was working at a 24-hour coffee shop, and my shift started at 3:45 a.m. Since this was the morning after the 4th of July, the normal firework party, loud-ass craziness of the holiday had kept me awake. I hadn't slept well because of all the commotion, so I was lethargic and exhausted, but managed to pull myself out of bed for my last shift of the week. Typically, I'm on high alert when I'm walking to my car, just for the sheer fact that my shift started early as hell, and in the city there are always weirdos. I always have my keys in hand, along with pepper spray and one of those small metal baton-looking things, since I've been assaulted before, and I'm legitimately always highly anxious when I'm alone at dark. So I was shuffling along, briskly walking, just trying to get to my car. I'm aware of my pace and just trying to get to my car as quickly as possible. I was maybe just 1 block from my car when out of the corner of my eye, I saw a thin, lanky, tall person bolt out from a door jamb shadowed by the porch, and he was pretty much behind me just as I passed the house. I assumed that he thought I wouldn't see him, but I don't know. What I found weird was how quickly he'd moved right behind me, because I was already very much nearly running to my car. I turned my head around to get a look at what the hell was going on, and I remember looking back at him multiple times, maybe 2, but also had to keep an eye on my route so I wouldn't lose my balance and fall over. I was trying to assess what he was doing so close to me, and my heart dropped when I looked back the last time, and I saw that he was almost face to face with me. We locked eyes and I yelled at him in the deepest, most intimidating voice I could muster. "Get away from me or I'll beat the crap out of you." As soon as I did this, he stopped coming at me and just kind of stopped briefly, staring at me with angry eyes. As I closed the distance between him and us, and my car, I was close enough to my car that I could hit the panic button, so I smashed it to try and alert my neighbours, if it mattered at all. He slinked off across to the opposite side of the street, and I got into my car and locked the doors immediately. As I put on my lights, he was back on my side of the street, on the street corner, staring at me in my car. Needless to say, I had a panic attack the whole way to work. I was 16 at the time when I met a boy on Facebook. He went to a school nearby, and after messaging each other for a while, we decided to meet up for a movie. We ended up having a great time together, so we started dating. The first time he came to my house to meet my parents, he was wearing an ankle monitor because he was on house arrest, but he wouldn't tell anyone why. Cue red flag number 1. And since he was a minor, we couldn't find out why either. Once knowing this, my parents obviously didn't allow us to hang out, so we'd see each other at his house or around town at the YMCA camp. I was a cheeky, rebellious and naive 16-year-old. Now things started to get weird when I noticed how his family was quite odd. One day we were in his bedroom, having a bit of us time, and I saw his father looking through the blinds. I screamed immediately and called him out on it, then his dad ran off. My boyfriend told me that his dad was just into redheads and liked to watch us, so I'm thinking that this wasn't the first time. As I went to leave to go home, his mum was doing crack in the kitchen. That was enough for me to decide it was definitely time to break up, and this is when it got bad. He started crying and told me that he was having cancer treatment and that's why he needed me, and he doesn't have long to live, blah blah blah. I naively believed him and told him we could just be friends, and this is when the stalking started. He switched schools to attend my high school, but never went to class. He would just stand outside of my classroom looking inside until it was passing period, and when I would leave class, he wouldn't address me. He would just follow about 10 to 15 feet behind me to my next period and stand outside the classroom again. I was too intimidated to say something to him by this point. I mean, he was 6'4" and heavily set, so I just let it go on for weeks on end. It then started to progress to where he would follow me home every day. He would get on the same bus as me, despite living across town, and walk 10 to 15 feet behind me all the way to my house. He would stand outside just staring up at the window until around the time my parents got home, and then he would leave. Finally, I worked up the courage to tell him to leave me alone and that we could no longer be friends or acquaintances. However, that escalated things even further. I began to get about 150 calls a night. Half of them were of him screaming death threats and in detailed torture methods that he wanted to administer to me, and the other half were him singing me love songs that he'd written on his guitar. Every time I blocked his number, he seemed to just magically get a new one and leave more messages on that. I woke up one day to see that overnight he had left me one of those dancing, singing snowmen on my porch. He had stabbed it in the head, and the knife was still sticking out. He'd covered it in his liquid deodorant that I had previously mentioned liking the smell of, and I noticed there was a hole where the little song recording device was. When I pressed the hand, it was not the regular Frosty the Snowman song that played, but his voice singing eerily, "I'm going to have you forever. I'm never going to let you be." I was done at this point and had to tell my parents, who then contacted the school. They suspended him, but he still waited at my bus stop every day and walked to my home behind me. One day he ran at me, like he was going to tackle me, and when I tensed up for the impact, he stopped abruptly and hugged me. But it wasn't a regular hug. It was like he was trying to crush me. I was 5'1" and about 90 pounds at the time, and he'd actually cracked one of my ribs. I cried and he started crying too before running off. He then left me a voicemail apologizing in song. Now there is one particular night that I'll never forget, and resulted in us getting a restraining order against him, and my dad got a gun. One evening I woke up seemingly for no reason, like fully awake. I got up to go to my kitchen to get a glass of water to relax, and in the reflection of my fridge, I could see movement in the backyard. Now I couldn't see very well because it was so dark outside and so light inside, so I went to the back sliding glass door to get a better look. Once there, I was met with the silhouette of a 6'4" man standing just outside the door. He was in my backyard, standing by my bedroom window at 3 a.m. He was just staring at me. I yelled and my parents got up, but he was gone by the time my dad went outside to find him. The patio is directly outside my bedroom window, so it is possible that he could have been on the patio looking directly into my bedroom before. We finally got a restraining order that was granted shortly after that, and Stalker Guy dropped out of school. I thankfully haven't seen him since in person, but around every 6 months he makes a new Facebook account and tries to friend request me. I just block it and report it every time. Scary stuff. Have any of you ever heard of that myth that if you wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, there's likely something looking at you? Well, maybe it's true. Hey there, it's me again, mystfyx. I hope you enjoyed my video. If you did, then please hit that subscribe button. And if you'd like to support me further, please check out my Patreon and sign up for as little as $1 a month. Also, check out my new YouTube membership levels for some exclusive perks. So until next time, stay happy, stay safe, and remember, keep being creepy.